Okay, so you've heard about fine motor and gross motor and you want to know the difference between the two? Great, you've come to the right place. In a nutshell, I'm going to describe the difference between fine and gross motor, but then we're going to dive deeper. We're going to go into the 7 biggest differences between fine and gross motor. That is what's going to happen. Even if you have been working with children for 100 years, I promise you some of these things will be really interesting and relevant to you. Okay, let's take a look. The easy answer is, in a nutshell, the difference between fine and gross motor skills are the size of the movements involved. So, fine motor is basically small movements of small muscles in our body. For example, it's muscles in the fingers, the hands, the toes, the face, and the tongue in particular. Those are what we're looking at. For gross motor, it's big movements of big muscles. So it's movements of the arms, the legs, the torso, and there we go. That in a nutshell is the difference between the two. Okay, let's go a bit deeper. Let's have a look at the 7 big differences between fine and gross motor skills. Number 1 is boys against girls. The big thing about this is boys develop their fine motor, generally speaking, slightly slower than girls. On the other hand, girls, some girls at least, might develop their gross motor skills at a slightly slower rate than boys. This is just a weird thing, it's just a thing of nature, it's just the way it is. It will be the same even in hundreds of years from now, it's just the way nature works. What this will look like in reality is a lot of boys sometimes will be slower to develop skills like writing, picking up things like beads and things like that, and they're often more reluctant to try those things out. On the other hand, you might get some girls that are quite reluctant to do things like ball games because they don't always have the gross motor capacity in the same way that some boys do. So that is, in a nutshell, the difference between boys and girls. Okay, number 2 is objects against non-objects. The big thing with this is fine motor skills are normally developed through using objects. Pretty much all fine motor skills involve picking things up, manipulating small things like weaving, threading, picking up beads, brushing your teeth, eating food, all that kind of stuff. Objects are involved. Gross motor, on the other hand, often needs no objects at all. It's things like running, jumping, hopping, rolling, crawling, and that kind of stuff. You can use objects, it can be things like ball games or using skipping ropes and things like that, but you don't always have to have objects. That's a big difference. Okay, number 3 is space. This is a big one. For gross motor skills, you need more space. You need freedom for them to move. It's good to have big equipment, things like big construction, things to climb on, big soil areas where they can dig and all that kind of stuff to develop their gross motor skills. Fine motor, on the other hand, needs no real big space at all. In fact, it's probably actually better in a smaller area where they can kind of focus their attention on what they're doing. You just need a small area, a few small objects, and away you go. Okay, number 4 is mark making. This is obviously a big one with fine motor, but also mark making, there's a lot of gross motor involved as well. From the fine motor perspective, if you're using things like pens and pencils, that's using lots of fine motor skills. But also gross motor, if you're doing things like using ribbons, big streamers in the air, or using massive chalks outside on big chalkboards, or painting water on fences, drawing with sticks in mud, all this kind of stuff, using big movements. You can do loads and loads of gross motor skills thrown into mark making. A lot of the best mark making activities for younger kids will have both fine motor and gross motor mixed in together. For example, they might be using chalk, which is using all the fingers, the fine motor, but they're using it on a huge shed that's been painted with chalkboard paint outside or something like that. And it's using all their arms, their shoulders, and all that kind of stuff as well. So there we go, mark making. Okay, number 5 is risks. Neither fine or gross motor are really all that risky, but it's worth knowing about the risks before you do it. The big risk with fine motor is choking. This is because you're using lots of small objects. The big things to think about are basically risk assess. Risk assess. If you think a child is going to eat an object, then just be mindful of that. If it's something really, really small, and you think they're going to eat it, then just do not use this because they could choke. So think about using things that are larger. Think about the age that some things are specified for. For example, if you buy pom-poms, it'll say on the packet what age the pom-poms are for. Don't use, really small pom-poms for 4-year-olds with 2-year-olds, for example. So just think about the age. Also, tidying up is a big one. If you've done a fine motor activity, at the end, pick all the bits up off the floor so no one comes along later and puts something in their mouth. Just supervise if you need to, and just be aware of choking with fine motor. The big one with gross motor is choking's not really involved in that at all. It's more stuff like collisions and things like running and falling over, building something, it falls over on you, climbing and falling off, all that kind of stuff. Just sort of good old-fashioned collisions. And just, again, it's not, you don't want to stop them, but it's just something to be aware of and helping them manage the risks themselves. Okay, number 6 is the rate of development. This is an interesting one. A lot of people think that you start with gross motor, then you move on to fine motor, but that's not really the way it works in reality. Basically, both gross motor and fine motor are starting reasonably early in life. Probably after a few months of our lives, we're starting to develop both. Even adults can develop their gross motor and their fine motor. If you sports, for example, you're developing gross motor, and if you learn to sew or something, develop learning fine motor skills. So we learn both throughout our lives. The big thing though is that gross motor, you do kind of learn it faster to start with, and you get to a more proficient level quicker. For example, in the first couple of years of life, lots of children are learning how to walk, run, jump, crawl, hop maybe, all that kind of stuff, roll. On the other hand, fine motor will take a few more years to develop often for a lot of children to be able to effectively mark, make, weave, that kind of thing. So gross motor, quicker, fine motor, slower. Okay, number 7 is the different type of activities you will need to develop both. Gross motor activities need big things, stuff like big equipment outside, big soil to dig in, big equipment, big mark-making tools. Just think big, think space, and think lots of freedom to move around. Fine motor, on the other hand, requires small things. You need things like tweezers, tongs, little beads, beans, bobbles, elastic bands, all sorts of like small things to manipulate and just to develop your fine motor skills. Okay, those are the 7 top reasons I can think of. Please do subscribe to the channel, subscribe and hit the bell. You'll get lots and lots of free content like this, at least 2 videos a week with lots of advice about maths, early literacy, early phonics, fine motor, loads of fun activities you can do with kids from the age of 3 upwards basically. So there we go. Please subscribe.